Hershey, one of the world's largest chocolate makers.
Hershey shares hitting an all-time high today. Where is that coming from?
People everywhere that I meet tell me stories about connections that they've had with our products and how important our brands have been in their life.
Hershey is one of the biggest chocolate companies in the world, worth nearly $47 billion. And yet, the Hershey company was founded by a boy who struggled through poverty and went bankrupt multiple times. This is the true rags to riches story of a chocolate empire. This is the insane and inspiring story of Milton Hershey. Milton Hershey's early life was difficult to say the least. He was born in 1857 in a rural dairy farming community called Dairy Township in Pennsylvania. Whilst Milton's parents both came from respectable families, Milton's father Henry had a bad habit of falling for shady get-rich-quick schemes. You see, Henry had always been determined to succeed in business, but he would rarely stick to any of the projects he started. He tried and failed 17 different businesses before moving the family to Oil City, Pennsylvania, and they only moved there because he was trying to get rich on a recent oil boom, but they arrived when it was already too late to make any money. Milton was just 4 years old at the time, and his father's poor financial decisions meant the Hershey family had almost completely run out of money. In fact, young Milton was extremely skinny and on the brink of starvation. Not just that, but Milton's mother was pregnant, and so they were soon going to have another mouth to feed. But then one day, Milton's uncles came to visit, and they saw how miserable the family had become. They hated seeing them this way, and generously offered Milton and his parents to live on a farm that they owned. They gratefully accepted, and not long after settling into their new home, Milton's mother gave birth to a daughter named Serena. So you'd think at this point, Milton's dad would embrace his steady new job working on the farm and work extra hard to support his family. But no, Henry got distracted by another get-rich-quick scheme. He would abandon the family for several months at a time, and whilst the plan was that he'd send money back home, he never ended up providing much money to help them survive. Thus, Milton's mum was struggling to keep little Milton and Serena fed and healthy without help from her husband. And then, one brutal winter, while Henry was away, Serena became sick. At first, it was assumed maybe she just had a cold, but as a red rash began to spread across her body, it soon became clear she had scarlet fever. She passed away at just 4 years old. This tragic incident of losing their daughter was the final straw in the relationship of Milton's parents. Meanwhile, young Milton's chaotic home life was rubbing off in his school life too. He was struggling badly, and whilst he had learned to read and write, before he even got to the 5th grade, he was forced to drop out of school so that he could work instead. When Milton was 13 years old, he got his first apprenticeship with a newspaper. In fact, Milton's dad actually signed him up for a 5-year contract with the paper, as he believed this would be a great career for his son. There was just one problem. Milton hated the job. Not only was the owner extremely bad-tempered, but the job wasn't something Milton was interested in at all. The newspaper had been his father's dream, not his, and yet he'd been signed up for 5 years of this. So one day whilst at work, Milton deliberately dropped his hat into a printing machine so that it would break. He was fired immediately, which meant he got out of the contract just like he'd hoped. Unsurprisingly, his father was very disappointed Milton had lost the apprenticeship. But his mother, on the other hand, knew how much Milton hated working for the newspaper and was glad he now had the chance to pursue a career he actually enjoyed. So at 14 years old, Milton began an apprenticeship with a candy maker called Royers. Here, he learned about buying ingredients from suppliers and how to make candies himself. In 1876, Milton completed his apprenticeship and by that point was convinced he'd found where his real passion was. His vision was now clear. He wanted to open his own candy shop. Of course, the apprenticeship had already given him a lot of first-hand experience of the business. And so, after a little persuading, he managed to convince his mother's family to loan him the money to set up a small candy shop of his own in Philadelphia. Milton began working around the clock to produce candies, as well as dried fruits and ice cream. Sometimes he wouldn't even go home to rest, and just fell asleep under the store counter. But luckily for Milton, he'd seemingly opened this new candy shop at the perfect time, because Philadelphia became the host of the country's first World's Fair, called the Centennial Exposition. People traveled from all over the world for this event, and Milton massively benefited from all the tourists who were looking to buy some sweets. Thanks to the event, he was able to turn a profit. One particularly creative tactic Milton used to bring in new customers was that he installed an air chute in the shop, which helped carry the sweet smell of the candy from the shop's kitchen to the outside air, enticing passers-by to come inside the shop and buy something. There was one big problem though. Milton was doing pretty much all of the work on his own. He couldn't afford to buy large equipment or hire employees to help make more candy, so no matter how hard he worked, he couldn't produce large enough volumes of candy to stay profitable. Plus, the price of sugar and some of his other ingredients were increasing. And of course, once the World's Fair had ended, less customers were passing by the store. Pretty soon, Milton was falling behind on his bills, and he was in constant fear that his suppliers would cut off his line of credit. Then one day in 1881, Milton's father Henry showed up and offered to help his son run the business. Despite knowing that his father had a terrible track record in business, Milton gladly accepted, since he needed all the help he could get. Working so much had been making Milton ill, and he knew support was necessary. And the good news was that his father came prepared with lots of ideas that he felt could help grow Milton's candy business. The bad news was that his father's ideas were all expensive. For example, producing cough drop candies and spending lots of money on a large window display. Unfortunately, Milton put too much trust in his father's big ideas, and he spread himself too thin financially. The business was soon in desperate need of more money, and fast. So Milton reached out to his uncle, a man named Abraham Snavely, to ask for another loan to pay off his debts. His uncle did agree to send him some money, but in the end it wasn't enough to keep the business afloat. After 6 years of running his candy shop in Philadelphia, Milton Hershey was forced to declare bankruptcy. The dream was dead. After failing with his first business in Philadelphia, Milton Hershey moved to New York City to try again, as he thought part of the problem with his first venture had been the location. But instead of opening a new store right away, Milton decided to work for another business first to learn what was popular in New York. He trained in a candy store called Hoyler's, and this is where he learned about a caramel recipe that incorporated fresh cream into the mixture, and this would later make a huge impact in his career. After a couple of years of working for Hoyler's and getting experience and saving money, Milton Hershey decided he was ready to open his own candy shop in New York City. And Milton began working 7 days a week at his new shop in Midtown Manhattan. This time, Milton's mother was the one to help with the business. She would diligently work on whatever he needed help with around the shop. However, Milton was still holding on to his father's false idea that cough drop candies would sell the best. In reality, sales weren't that great. Plus, there was even more competition in New York. And so, just like his first shop, Milton's second candy shop also went out of business. Milton was forced to move back home after failing for a second time. And to make matters even worse, when he returned home, he received a letter in the mail that he was being sued for $10,000 for the money he borrowed to buy candy making equipment in New York. Milton Hershey was just 28 years old, but he was already turning grey. The stress of his 2 bankruptcies seemingly made him look much older than he actually was. Once again, Milton swallowed his pride and walked 5 miles to the family farm to ask his uncles for another loan. This time though, they turned him down. They said he'd grown up to be too much like his father, and they refused to waste any more of their money on him. This really hurt Milton, but mostly because he knew they were right. He felt guilty for letting his family down, but he would later reflect that wanting to prove to his family that he could be successful was one of the biggest motivations for him to keep going. So even though he had failed with 2 different candy stores, Milton Hershey did not give up on his dreams. After moving back to his home of Lancaster, Pennsylvania, Milton realized this was actually the perfect place to expand a caramel business, especially since Lancaster was one of the largest dairy producers in the country. The only trouble was finding the money to get started. By this point, his credit was ruined, and he could no longer rely on loans from his family. The one thing Milton did have though was some supplies left over from his failed business in New York. So using those remaining ingredients and the fresh milk that was readily available in Lancaster, Milton created a recipe for a new product, melt-in-your-mouth caramels, which proved to be extremely popular with the locals. Milton started small this time though. He made candy from home and then got a pushcart to travel around the streets of Lancaster selling his caramels. Of course, making these products by hand and selling them all by himself was not a very sustainable or scalable business. He really needed more funding so he could buy new equipment, but understandably the banks were very reluctant to loan him any money. However, in 1886, Milton's family once again came through for him. This time it was his Aunt Mattie. While she couldn't afford to give Milton the money herself, when she saw Milton's new caramels genuinely seemed to be a popular product, she agreed to co-sign on a $700 loan from the bank and put down her own house as collateral. Even with this, the bank was still hesitant to loan Milton the money, and so they wrote in the agreement that the loan needed to be paid back within just 90 days. Milton knew how serious the stakes were this time. If he failed to repay the bank loan in 90 days, his beloved Aunt Mattie, the only one who still seemed to believe in Milton, would lose her home. So, Milton didn't waste a second. Once he got the $700 loan from the bank, he used that money to buy new candy making equipment and founded the Lancaster Caramel Company. And luckily, all of those years of trial and error with the previous ventures had not gone to waste. Milton learned from his past mistakes. In the big cities, there were dozens of candy shops to choose from, but in Lancaster, there was absolutely no competition. Milton also realized he could make more money by selling caramels in bulk rather than individual penny candies like he'd done in his two previous businesses. And this was possible since his mother and aunt both worked for free wrapping caramels for him. And thus, Milton's third business got off to a good start, and things looked promising. But 90 days is not a long time, and Milton grew increasingly anxious as each day passed by, knowing that he would soon need to pay back the $700 loan to the bank. As the deadline grew closer, Milton was extremely stressed, knowing he was on the brink of bankruptcy yet again. But just as all hope looked lost for repaying the loan on time, something miraculous happened. A rich businessman from England just so happened to be visiting the area, and once he tasted Hershey's caramels, he liked them so much that he decided to import them back to the UK. He made a massive order of caramels to be sold in shops throughout England. This one order alone was enough to save Hershey, and he was able to pay off his bank loan with literally just a couple of days to spare. And that big order was just the beginning. As word of his products spread across Europe, Milton began getting more and more international orders. So much so that he was able to expand his business, firstly by hiring employees, and then by opening new stores in other areas. And that's because Milton had created a product that not only had a unique great taste, but also had a long shelf life, unlike many other candies of the time which perished quickly. As a result, lots of shops wanted to buy his caramels, which he marketed under the brand name Crystal A. Motivated by this success, Milton continued to work relentlessly hard, and repeatedly reinvested company profits into more expansion. Over the next few years, Milton managed to grow the Lancaster Caramel Company into a team of hundreds of employees. Milton even opened multiple factories in Pennsylvania and Illinois, and so at 36 years old, Milton Hershey could put those years of failure behind him. He had finally made it and was a truly successful businessman. But this is not the story of just a successful businessman. This is the story of an empire, and that's because of one event in 1893 that changed Milton's life forever. Milton Hershey was now a wealthy man, and the Lancaster Caramel Company was very successful. But now that Milton had been able to hire such a large team, he finally had more time on his hands, and Milton never stopped looking for that next big thing. In 1893, Milton attended the World's Columbian Exposition in Chicago, and here he met chocolate makers from a German firm called J.M. Lehman's. They brought their chocolate making equipment to the exposition and put it on display. Now, at the time, chocolate was a luxury that was just for the wealthy, and that's because it normally had to be handmade and was typically imported from Switzerland. As a result, most people had never tasted chocolate before in their life. But Milton realized that if he purchased this new German chocolate making equipment, he could make chocolate more accessible to the average person. And he believed that once people tasted chocolate, it would become the most popular candy in the world. Needless to say, he bought the chocolate making equipment. In 1894, Milton established the Hershey Chocolate Company. But Milton believed in chocolate so much that in 1900, he sold his main business, the Lancaster Caramel Company, for $1 million. With modern inflation, that's closer to $35 million. But at the time, his family thought he was crazy to give up such a successful business in order to take a risk on chocolate. But Milton told them, caramels are only a fad, chocolate is a permanent thing. Hershey had already seen in Europe that sales of chocolate had been cutting into the market share of his caramels, and so he could tell that a pivot was needed. And you have to give Milton credit here, because when you have something that's working well, like with Hershey's caramel business, it's easy just to try and maintain what you have rather than think about what comes next. Just look at how many market leaders have failed to innovate and fallen as a result. But Milton could clearly see the chocolate business was going to be far bigger than caramels, and so he went all in on it. However, Milton Hershey's success was not just from the fact he was early to get into the chocolate business, but instead because he was the first in America to perfect the mass production of milk chocolates. You see, Milton had hired a whole team to help them figure out how they could make milk chocolate that wouldn't turn rancid after a few days. It took a lot of trial and error, but eventually a man Milton hired named John Schmalbach found a way to warm and condense the milk without burning it, creating delicious milk chocolate that could be stored for months without going bad. Hershey rewarded him with a $100 bill for his discovery. A nice fee at the time, but a tiny price to pay given the discovery was essentially the foundation of the company's entire success. This ability to produce milk chocolate that could be stored for a long time meant they could mass produce it in very large quantities and significantly lower costs. Thus, they could sell their chocolate for just 5 cents, meaning chocolate was no longer a luxury exclusive for the rich. Another reason they were able to produce it so cheaply was Milton's decision to sell a small selection of products. Whereas other chocolatiers tried to offer a wide variety, Hershey focused on just the most popular ones, meaning they could produce them in high quantities, which both reduced operational complexity and let them benefit from economies of scale, where the cost of each chocolate bar becomes cheaper as they were producing so many of them in bulk. Aside from their classic milk chocolate bar, which they began creating in 1900, one of their most popular products was launched in 1907, a foil-wrapped candy called the Sweetheart, which was soon renamed Hershey's Kisses and continues to be popular to this day. Hershey's also has another classic product, Mr. Good Bar, and fun fact, the name for that is simply because someone told Milton, "That's a good bar," and he misheard them and thought they'd said Mr. Good Bar, but then the name just stuck. However, despite the success of Milton's chocolate business, Milton continued to work almost all hours of the day, every day. He was constantly trying to come up with ideas to grow the business. This story's Milton even paid janitors at schools not to pick up Hershey's wrappers off the ground so people would see the brand name more. However, Hershey's sneakiest tactic of all was that he told some of his most loyal employees to essentially go undercover and get jobs at competitor firms such as the chocolate manufacturers in Europe so they could learn their competitors' methods and trade secrets. By 1910, Hershey's sales topped $2 million and continued to grow rapidly from there, and so Milton's decision to sell his caramels business and go all in on chocolate had clearly been validated. Sadly, his beloved Aunt Mitty, who'd supported him and co-signed his bank loan, died of pneumonia right before his chocolate business began, and so she didn't get to see it. Milton did manage to escape some tragedy himself though, as in 1911, Milton had bought tickets for the Titanic and was due to set sail on April 10th, 1912. However, due to a last-minute business matter that cropped up, Hershey decided to cancel the trip at the last minute. Of course, we all know how the Titanic ended up, so it was a lucky escape for Milton. But there's another decision of Milton's that's even more interesting, which is the fact that he decided to create his own town. When Milton Hershey first started his chocolate business, he'd bought a huge property for his new chocolate factory in his hometown of Derry Township. He also chose to build a house within walking distance of the factory so that it was quick to commute to work. But right from the very beginning, Milton Hershey wanted to make sure that he created a good working environment for his employees too. He said, "What I want to do more than anything else is to give my employees an opportunity to advance themselves in this world and to give them a helping hand." And since Derry Township was so remote, Milton had the idea of creating a whole town nearby for his workers, where he would build houses, schools, parks, and public transport. It would be the ideal town for his employees to live and be as comfortable as possible, as he felt if his workers were happy, his company would thrive. Now, pretty much everyone told Milton it was a crazy idea to build a town, but soon enough, he'd bought the land, paid for roads to be paved, a town square to be built, and affordable housing was set up with modern amenities like indoor plumbing and central heating. Thus, his vision of building a town for his workers had become a reality. And still to this day, there is the town of Hershey in Pennsylvania, thanks to Milton Hershey. Soon after the factory workers began settling in the town of Hershey, employees were writing to their friends and family about how great this brand new town was. This within itself was free advertising, since the company and town were both called Hershey. Over the next few years, Milton also decided to build an open-air theater, zoo, golf course, and concert hall for employees and guests to have fun. Milton also came up with the idea to start printing out postcards of the town and including them with the purchase of every chocolate bar, so people would see images of what the town looked like, which made them even more curious to visit. This town that revolved around chocolate quickly became a tourist destination. But the town's biggest attraction is Hershey Park, which is now one of the largest regional amusement parks in America, even though it was initially just constructed as a place for Milton's employees to spend time with their families. However, whilst the town and business was a success, during World War I, a problem arose for Milton. There was a ration of sugar, and so the cost of supplies began to skyrocket. So, in 1916, Milton Hershey decided to build his own sugar refinery, and he established another town of Hershey, but this time in Cuba, where sugar was in large supply. By 1918, construction of the sugar mill was complete, and his new employees got to work. Just like in the first Hershey town in the US, he built houses, schools, and health clinics for his workers, and on top of building a new town, Hershey built a railroad that ran through all the major ports of Cuba. Hershey was able to cut costs and increase production, and in fact, during World War II, he was commissioned by the US military to create Hershey's Ration D bar for the troops, as well as Hershey's Tropical Chocolate, which was chocolate that wouldn't melt. As time went on, Hershey's continued to grow larger each year. Through a series of acquisitions and license deals, Hershey's began selling other major candy brands like Reese's, M&M's, Kit Kats, Rolos, Cadbury's, and Twizzlers. For years, the Hershey Chocolate Company continued to grow and was selling chocolates all around the world. But when the Great Depression hit, Milton Hershey wanted to do something to ensure that the children of his employees could grow up to find jobs. He knew that education was key to having a good life, and he wanted to give the families of his factory workers every opportunity to succeed. And thus, Milton promised that all of the children of his factory workers would receive a private education through high school. He also founded the Hershey Junior College and gave every child 2 years of free tuition. Not just that, but since Milton and his wife were unable to have children of their own, they set up the Hershey Industrial School, which was initially designed to give free education to poor orphans and give them opportunities they wouldn't have otherwise had, thus allowing them to find jobs once they came of age. Nowadays, the school is simply named the Milton Hershey School and is no longer an orphanage, but instead a private boarding school for children from underprivileged families. As well as free education, it gives kids in need access to medical help, clothing, well-cooked meals, and much more. It's genuinely life-changing for them, and it began because Milton himself knew firsthand what it was like growing up in poverty, and he didn't want others to go through that too. He wanted to give these kids who start out in life with very difficult circumstances the best chance to build a great life for themselves. Not only did Milton plow a lot of money into this school during his lifetime, he set it up in his will so that a large portion of proceeds from both Hershey's chocolate business and money from the amusement park and other Hershey projects would funnel back to the Milton Hershey School, so that the kids were always taken care of as a priority. One thing I found particularly impressive about this is that Milton didn't allow the use of the school in any Hershey's advertising. Because these days many businesses have charitable efforts, but it's clear they're doing it so it makes their brand look good. They'll often spend more money advertising their charity work than actually giving to charity. And of course, that's better than nothing. But my point is, Milton genuinely seemed to do this for altruistic reasons, not business. It seems like he recognized he was fortunate to have a couple of family members like his mother and aunt who really looked out for him, and he wanted to make sure other poor kids had someone looking out for them too. Now, as for Milton, he remained a workaholic all his life, and he didn't retire as chairman of the Hershey board until age 87, and then he passed away of pneumonia just a year later in 1945. But he transferred the majority of his assets to the Milton Hershey School, including a large percentage of Hershey stock, thus making the school one of the wealthiest private schools in the world. He did this to ensure that all of his charities would continue to exist long after his death, and that his fortune would be used to help those in need. Now, of course, I'm not saying Milton Hershey was perfect. Nobody is. For example, there are stories of him having a bad temper and often being difficult to work with. But overall, it does seem like Milton did a lot of good in the world, and genuinely made an extremely positive difference in a lot of people's lives. As for the Hershey Company, after more than 125 years in business, the company is currently valued around $47 billion and remains one of the world's largest chocolate manufacturers. Over 3 million people visit Hershey Park every year, and Hersheystown in Pennsylvania is still going strong. Several chocolate companies, including Hershey's, were named in a lawsuit concerning child labor happening in plantations on the Ivory Coast. While these chocolate companies don't own these farms, they're still profiting off all the free labor of children. Now, to be fair, since then, Hershey's say they've created a child labor monitoring and remediation system to try and prevent these brutal working conditions. But success story. So, light or dark? Take your pick now, and whichever video you choose, I'll see you there in a second. Cheers.